I am introducing Ron. Ron Culberson ranks as one of the top 30 of his wife's famous and most renowned favorite speakers. He worked as a hospice social worker, a middle manager, a director of quality improvement at a hospital of Northern Virginia. Ron was also the 2012-2013 president of the National Speakers Association and was inducted into the organization's Hall of Fame. From the creative perspective, Ron has written 4 books, produced hundreds of blog posts, and co-produced 2 children. Please welcome Ron Culberson.
So this chicken walked into a library one day, walked up to the librarian and went, "Book!" The librarian looked down and said, "You want a book?" The chicken went, "Book!" So the librarian gave the chicken a book. The chicken left the library. 10 minutes later, comes back in the library, puts the book up on the counter, looks up at the librarian and went, "Book, book!" And the librarian said, "2 books?" The chicken went, "Book, book!" So the librarian gave the chicken 2 books. Chicken left the library. 10 minutes later, comes back in the library, puts the 2 books up on the counter, looks up at the librarian and went, "Book, book, book!" Well, at this point, the librarian knew the routine. So the librarian gave the chicken 3 books, but decides to follow the chicken out of the library, across the street, down the hill, and watches as that chicken takes those 3 books and puts them on the ground right next to this big bullfrog. The bullfrog looks down and goes, "Read it, read it, read it." So I think you can see that your planning committee has spared no expense. So my father-in-law told me that joke 20 years ago, and I looked at him and said, "That is the stupidest joke I have ever heard in my life." And I was at the time a hospice social worker and was speaking at a hospice conference and was there with a bunch of my colleagues, and we were at dinner one night, and I told that joke, and those people fell out of their chairs. And I thought, I have underestimated this joke. And I will tell you, one of the highlights of my career was I got to tell that joke in front of 800 librarians. I will never pay a late fee. So why would I start off with such a stupid joke? I think we're just a little bit too serious these days. Would you agree with me? Yeah, we've gotten a little grumpy over the last year and a half. It reminds me, I don't know if you ever saw, there was an old Monty Python skit where these old guys were talking about their childhood. I don't know if you ever saw this or not, but one of them said, "My father used to wake us up at 4 a.m. He served us cold rocks for breakfast, and we worked 14 hours a day." And the other guy went, "Luxury. My father woke us up 2 hours before we went to bed. He would smack us about in the morning with a broken bottle, and then we worked 23 hours a day for a penny." And I thought, that's where we're going. That's what we're all going to be like when we get older, you know? This is it. I think we have to reverse this process. And the way I think we have to reverse it is we got to start at the end and work backwards. That's the thing I think has to work. Now let's think about it as we go through our life. How many of you, just raise your hand, how many of you love graduation parties? How many love graduation parties, right? Like whether it's high school, college, graduation parties? All right, nobody's raised their hand, so clearly not a party-going crowd, but I saw you last night. Don't you tell me you're not a party-going. Yeah, so graduation parties are great. And then how many of you like weddings, going to weddings, right? Weddings are a great party. My daughter was supposed to get married last summer. And, of course, she got married but didn't get to have the reception. So we had the reception about 2 months ago. Her father-daughter dance that she picked was Guns N' Roses' Sweet Child of Mine. And I dressed like Axl Rose because, you know, he did this thing like this, you know, like this. It was great fun. It was great fun. And how many of you like retirement parties? How many like retirement parties, right? How many are close? How many of you are just tired but you're not retired yet? All right. And then last show of hands, I'm just curious, how many love funerals? Raise your hand, raise your hand. Your own or somebody else's, doesn't matter which. See, this is what's so weird. So we hate funerals, right? I remember the story about these 3 guys sitting in a bar, and they were sitting there, they started talking about what they, like if somebody's at their funeral looking over the coffin, what they wanted them to say about them, like friends, family, coworkers, what would you want them to say about you? And one guy said, well, I'd want them to say that I was a good husband. I loved my wife very much. The second guy said, I'd want him to say, I was a good father. I was always there for my kids. Third guy said, I want him to say, hey, look, he's moving. But see, this is the thing. I think funerals are the one thing. We're guaranteed, right? We are guaranteed to experience this, right? We're all guaranteed to experience the end of life. And yet none of us are trained how to deal with funerals. None of us are trained how to deal with grief and loss. It's the one thing we all know we're going to get. We never get taught in school any of this, right? We're never taught how to deal with it. As a matter of fact, when you get to that point, you got to make decisions like, do you get cremated? Do you get buried? All this. A friend of mine called me one day. She said her dad had died and was going to be cremated, and they went to the funeral home to look at urns and pick them out. And she said her brothers look at them and go, these are all just too serious looking. And she goes, yeah, they're too earnest. And I thought that was funny. But you know what they ended up doing? They ended up burying him in a growler because he loved beer. I think that's brilliant. But see, this is what I think has to happen. We have to understand that, that this is something we have to deal with, and we have to understand how to do it. Now, when we get to the end of our lives, our accomplishments, for the most part, are not going to matter. Our material world is not going to matter. When my mom died in 2016, she was 94 years old. We go to the funeral, nobody talks about her house. Nobody talked about her car. Nobody talked about any item in her house. They didn't hardly even talk about her job. What did they talk about? They talked about her character, right? They talked about who she was as a person and how she made them feel. Now, she worked at a little small college in southwestern Virginia called Emory and Henry College. That's where I grew up. She was a secretary to the dean of students. And in the alumni magazine, they printed an obituary for her, and this is what they wrote. She was rarely not found in fits of laughter. She cheated at cards. She never passed a Krispy Kreme donut shop without stopping to pay respects. She was a cherished friend to students, had a lifelong devotion to chocolate, was the subject of at least 2 or 3 stories that could be told by every person that knew her. And I think that captured her beautifully. It's exactly what she was like. I think all of us would want an obituary written like that, wouldn't we? I remember going to a funeral of a guy who was in my church. He was a former Navy chaplain. He was one of the guys that was one of those people that was just the most respectful kind of guy, one of those people that everybody respected. And I remember going to the funeral, and people were talking about him, and his son got up and talked. And his son got up there and said, a couple of years before the funeral, he had asked his dad, do you have any regrets? And his father looked at him and said, son, my life has been so full, there wasn't room for regret. And I just thought, how great would it be to die like that your life was so full, there was not room for regret. And then a few years ago, like 3 years ago, unfortunately, one of my college roommates died in an automobile accident. And he was this beloved high school teacher in Richmond, Virginia. And we went to a memorial service that was held at the high school. 1,500 people were in there. 1,500 people came to this because he was such a beloved teacher. And I remember students, one after another, came up to talk about him, and he was really good at the fringe students, the kids that didn't fit in. They loved him, and he supported them. And this one kid got up, and what you need to know about my friend and I, we went to college at the University of Virginia. That's where we went to school. And our arch rival is Virginia Tech, right? That's our arch rival is Virginia Tech. So this student came up to my friend, and he said, I went up to Mr. Phillips, and I couldn't decide where to go to college. I'd been accepted at Virginia Tech and the University of Virginia. He said, I didn't know where to go. And he said, I said to Mr. Phillips, Mr. Phillips, I don't know what to do. The Virginia Tech people are telling me that God was clearly a hokey because in the fall he turns the trees maroon and orange. And he said, Mr. Phillips looked at me and said, well, yeah, so what? He goes, maroon and orange stuff comes out of my dog's butt too. And that was at the memorial service. 15 people leapt out of their feet and cheered and laughed because that represented who he was as a person. That's why I like funerals. Funerals remind us of what we need to do. Funerals get us grounded. They tell us what our lives are all about. And unfortunately, they come at the end of our lives and don't really prepare us. But when we think about it going forward, we think about, maybe I need to think about this a little bit more. We are prepared to deal with it a little bit better. Now, I know it's going to sound weird. I grew up in the world of hospice care. That's why this stuff intrigues me. I was a hospice social worker for 10 years. At 25 years of age, I was the youngest person in my hospice. That didn't happen back in the mid-'80s. People didn't go right out of school into hospice care. And imagine that, as a 25-year-old, I got to sit by the bedside of people who are at the end of their lives, and they taught me what they learned. It changed everything about my life. It changed the way I see the world. It changed the way I do things, the decisions I make. It informed where I am at this point as a 60-year-old. Now, this is going to sound really weird, but this is what we hospice people do. I've got an app on my phone. The app is called We Croak. See, there's a Buddhist philosophy that says if you are reminded 5 times a day that you will one day die, you'll live differently. So 5 times a day, I get an alert on my phone. It says, don't forget you're going to die. But then when you swipe it open, it takes you to some profound quote that's really about living. So in a backwards kind of way, it keeps us grounded in what's important, right? So years ago, I was thinking about my own life, and I was looking back and I was saying, what is it that I've done successfully? I mean, I've been a hospice social worker, I've been at other jobs, I've been the president of a national association, I'm in all kinds of volunteer organizations, and everything I did, I was reasonably successful at it. And I was like, why was I successful at these things? And I boiled it down to 2 things. I realized that everything I did, I tried to do a good job, but then I tried to make the process a little more enjoyable. So years ago, you might remember this, Volkswagen came out with a video series under the premise that if they made things more fun, people would do things that were good for them. And it was called the Volkswagen Fun Theory. This was one of the first viral videos on YouTube. And what they did was they went to a subway station in Stockholm, Sweden, where there was a stairway next to an escalator. And they turned the stairway into piano keys. Remember this? And it played like a piano when you stepped on each step. And they had set up cameras to do a before and after comparison. And when you watch the video, you'll see things like this. You'll see somebody start to go up the escalator, and then they'll look over and see that the stairs are playing like a piano. They go up the stairs. Or you'll see somebody going all over the stairs trying to play a song on the stairs, just going over and over like this. Or you'll see a little kid just doing this on one stair all the time. When they compared the before and after, they found that 66% more people took the stairs when it was fun to take the stairs. It's not rocket science, right? We all know this. We know we're going to do things if they're more fun. We're more likely to do them. But why don't we implement this concept in our lives? We don't do this in our life. Now, there's one area that you do this, right? It's when you exercise, right? When you exercise, you listen to music, or if you're on a treadmill, you watch TV or watch a movie. Why? Because miserable. It's miserable. Exercise is miserable, right? So we do this in that area of our life, but you don't do it anywhere else. Do you do it when you run meetings? Do you do it when you're doing paperwork? Do you do it on sales calls? Do you do it with client interactions? If we filtered everything through this process of doing things well but making it fun, it's amazing how that would change things. So I wrote a book in 2012 called Do It Well, Make It Fun. It's all about seek excellence first and then make the journey more enjoyable. The easiest way to explain this is if you ever had a boss that was really good at what he or she did but was fun to be around, you didn't mind going to work. You respected them for their skills, but you enjoyed being around them because they were fun. So this all developed from both my experience and my hospice work, but then also I got trained at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement in process improvement. So here's the way this whole works. Do it well, make it fun. Very simple concept. First of all, everything you do is a process. Everything you do in life and work is a process. When you came to this conference, you engaged in a process to get here, starting with the decision to come and ending up in the seat you're in right now. So then when you look at processes, the way you change processes is you change the steps. Because every process has steps, and all the steps had the potential of being changed. And with do it well, make it fun, that means you can make it better or make it more enjoyable. So I like to compare this to a recipe. When you make a recipe, you know, when you're cooking, I like to cook. I'm a hobby cook. The recipe has ingredients and steps. And if you start messing with any of those, it changes the end result. So if you want to make something a little spicier, you add more spice. Make it mild or take away the spice. So you can play around with the ingredients and the steps, and the end result is changed. Now, baking is not the same. Baking's too precise. I hate baking. You mess up one thing and it doesn't look right and doesn't taste right, right? But cooking is like a blank slate. You can be creative with it. And that's what our lives are like. We start looking at our life and start going, how can I make this different? You break down the process into steps and you change it. So let me give you an example of a real life experience where you have steps in a process. I don't know what it was like when you all got driver's ed, but I took driver's ed in southwestern Virginia, middle of the Appalachian Mountains, in the late 70s, and it was taught by the football coaches. Anybody else have that experience where the football coaches taught driver's ed? All right, a number of you, right? So they teach you in the class, and then they took you out in the driver ed car, and what'd they do? They yelled at you the whole time. Because that's what coaches do, right? They call you by your last name, and they yell at you, right? So when you went in the driver's ed car, you remember when you got in that car, you got in the car, there were about 4 things you had to do before they'd ever let you put the key in the ignition. Do you remember that? What was the first thing? Mandatory. First thing you get in that car, you had to do automatically. You had to put your seatbelt on. Then you had to adjust the mirror, you had to make sure the car was in gear, and your foot had to be on the brake before you ever put that key in the ignition, right? Let me ask you this. What would happen if you didn't do one of those steps? The coach would yell at you. Start over. Do it again until you do it right, right? Now, when you came to this conference, you either drove here or you drove to an airport. When you drove to get to this event and you got in your car, did you go through those 4 steps before you put the key in the ignition? No, you didn't. Some of you, a couple miles down the road, you're still trying to get your seatbelt on. That's because you got a latte in this hand and you're steering with your knee. So how do we go from we have to do it all right before we can even start till we're not doing any of it right? This is what happens in life, right? We slip into habits and routines and we stop paying attention. And I believe that Do It Well, Make It Fun is about paying attention. It's paying attention to everything we do and being conscious and aware. It's not being on autopilot. We are on autopilot so much. It's like the idea of multitasking. There is no such thing as multitasking. I mean, I can walk and talk, so I guess that's multitasking, but when it comes to doing tasks, you can't do 2 things at once because you're not focusing on either fully. You're going back and forth. You ever been on the phone and you're doing something else when you're on the phone? And then at some point through the conversation you go, what was that? It's because you weren't listening, right? You're trying to multitask. There's no such thing. So when we focus and we pay attention, what happens then is we start to see the possibilities in life and we see things a little bit differently. So this is how this whole process works, is that Do It Well, Make It Fun is really about helping us look at things differently. So I want to take you through 2 processes today, 2 ways of filtering this for our lives and managing it so that you change the effect on your life. The first way is, how do you manage your stress? How do you manage the way that you do your work? You manage your life. How do you manage yourself? And the second is, how do you manage the work? How do you look at the work you have to do on a regular basis and manage it so that you're looking at things through this filter? Now, I'll take you through some examples. So first, let's talk a little bit about stress. Do you know what I know about stress? Stress is not automatically stressful. It's not automatically stressful. I would dare say that 80% of the stress we experience in our life has nothing to do with what's going on in our life and everything to do with how we see what's going on in our life. And you know how I know this? Because everybody in this room, every single one of you, has somebody in your life that if you see them coming, you get a knot in your stomach. You might get a hot flash. You're getting all worked up and nothing's happened yet, right? This tells me it's all up here because nothing's been said or done, and yet your mind is already kicked in and you're already reacting to it. So in other words, you're creating stress out of a situation that's not stressful already. So this is what I think we do throughout our lives. We create stress when stress is not already there, right? So I'm going to give you an example about this because I think stories are illustrations of ways to see things and help us to sort of take information and boil it down so that we get the essence of it without being overwhelmed with too much information. So stories kind of capsulize it like that. So I'm one of these people. I studied humor in graduate school. I got my graduate thesis. I focused it on humor and the benefits of humor and laughter. So I come out of graduate school, and I'm funny, so I've been told, by nature, and I studied humor, so I started doing programs on humor in the workplace. That's what I started doing. So I was thinking about this later. I was like, when I'm encountering something stressful, I have the ability to see the humor in it, and sometimes I use that ability, and then sometimes my mind gets caught up in it and takes me a different direction. And you know, when our minds get involved, our minds love chaos. They like chaos, and they like to take us places we don't necessarily need to go. If you ever woke up at 3 in the morning and you can't go back to sleep, it's because your mind's focused on something that you can't possibly do at 3 in the morning. And yet we go with it. We're like, it must know better than me. So we go with it. So our minds get involved, and yet I have the skills to deal with this. So I'll give you an example. I travel quite a bit. Pre-COVID, I traveled more. We're starting to travel a little bit more. A couple of years ago, I was going through TSA, and I had just bought a new watch band. It was a metal watch band, and I knew it was going to set off the metal detector. So I was trying to take it off, and the TSA agent was standing there right in front of me while I took off my watch, and I'm trying to take my watch off, and the clasp is hung up somehow. I can't seem to get it to come off, and I'm standing there struggling with it, and I finally get it undone, and I'm pulling it off my hand, and it drops to the floor. And I don't want it to hit the floor, so I try to grab it before it hits the floor. Instead of grabbing it, I smack it. So I smack it like 20 feet across the TSA area. Now, I don't know about you, I don't want to look suspicious in the TSA area. I don't want them to think I got something going on. And I just smacked my watch across TSA. And the guy's standing right in front of me, and I'm looking at my watch, and I'm looking at him, and I was like, time flies. And he laughed, and I laughed. I went and got my watch, and everything was all right. Now, see, if I could do that every time, I would be a happy camper because I'd just reduce all the stress. My stress was gone just like that. But I don't do that all the time because my head and my mind get involved and try to convince me otherwise. So I was right back there. I was at Washington Dulles Airport, which is the airport I fly out of a lot. And I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you go through TSA and there's two agents checking IDs, and then you go around and you merge into one line, right? To go through the conveyor belt and the x-ray machine, the metal detector. And when you do that, you know what you do. You come around, y'all just alternate. Each side alternates to go through the metal detector. So that's what happened. So they checked my ID. I came around, and just as I come around, there's a woman coming around from the other side. So I look at her and said, please go ahead. But before I could step in behind her, another woman behind her steps up and gets in line. Now that's not the sequencing pattern. And she was not looking at me, so I think she knew she was doing something wrong. You know, if you're out on the highway and you decide you're not going to let somebody merge, you don't look at them. Because if you do, they'll give you a hand signal. You don't need to see that. So she's just not making eye contact with me. So before she can put her stuff up on the conveyor belt, I just did this. And I turned around and she went like this. And I'm sitting there going, with these hand gestures. Like what? That's like going, like this. I'm like, I want to feel like a parent. Can you use your words? And I turned to her and I said, I think we're alternating here. I think we're taking turns. And she looked at me and she goes, that's okay. If you're in that big of a hurry, please go ahead. No, I'm not in a hurry. We're alternating. I said, look, this woman went in front of me, so I waited to step in behind her. My wife, who's with me, she got in behind you because we're alternating. We're taking turns. And then I said, we're taking alternations, which made no sense whatsoever. And she looked at me and she said, okay, that's fine. We'll all wait for you. And I'm like, are you kidding me? I'm not cutting in line. We're alternating. Alternate. All as in all of us are doing it. Turn as in we're taking turns. And eight, even an 8-year-old knows how to alternate. And it was about at that point that it occurred to me that I had lost it just a tad. And now I'm not making eye contact with anybody, but I can feel everybody looking at me. And I just want to get through this whole thing, get through the conveyor belt and the x-ray machine and be done. And a bag got stuck in the conveyor belt. And I'm just standing, I can feel like little beads of sweat rolling down my back. And finally the machine gets going again and I go to walk through the x-ray machine and I hear beep. The TSA agent looked at me and said, sir, you've been chosen for a random screening. So I get my stuff and I go all the way over here to this other area where I take my shoes off, my belt off. They wand me, they pat me down. They took every single thing out of all my bags. And the whole time I'm standing there, I can see that woman going off to her flight. And I was like, that's karma right there. Now here's the thing that bothered me was the entire rest of the day I was upset, but not because of what she did. I was upset with what I did. I got really upset with my behavior because I did not need to react like that, right? I mean, what's the worst case scenario? I let her go in front of me and then I step in line behind her. You know, what would that have taken, like 2 seconds? But you know what my head said to me? My head said, she's cheating. You need to cut this off before it gets out of hand. Because if she cheats, everybody's going to cheat. You'll have a line of people, you'll never get on your plane. So you got to stop this right now. And I'm thinking, that's ridiculous. That is just not going to happen. That is not going to happen at all. And I will tell you that experience changed me. I'm not the same person. I don't get upset like that anymore. Because when I'm somebody cuts me off in the grocery store, I just step back now and I say, please go ahead. If I'm trying to get off a plane and there's always that one person who wants to run up the aisle and get off before everybody else, I'm just like, please go ahead. Because when they go by me, I can trip them. I can still win. I can still win, right? So this is what happens is our heads get involved, and I think we need to understand this. We don't understand how quickly we react to things. How quickly we react to things. And so I call them knee flexes. They're like knee-jerk reflexes where we just respond without thinking. And after years and years of doing this, we're so unaccustomed to really paying attention that I think it happens before we know it. So if you look at to break down the principles of stress, it's so simple. Something happens, we see it a certain way, and that leads to our reaction, right? I was at a conference one time, and I asked people, what's the one thing that kind of gets, like I just did I was roving around, it was like a 2 or 3 hour program, and I was just asking people, what's that one thing that gets under your skin, you know, that it's so stressful that if we could remove that from your life, like it happens on a regular basis, if we could remove that from your life would be perfect. And one woman raised her hand, and I said, what is it? She said, traffic. I just get so stressed out in traffic. And I said, where do you live? She goes, Atlanta. I'm like, look at where you live. I mean, you're going into traffic thinking there's not going to be traffic. That's crazy, right? But that's what we do. We think we're going to be fine, and then something happens, we're not prepared for it, right? I'll never forget this one situation. I said, what gets under your skin? I said, what is the one thing in your life that if you could remove it, your life would be perfect? You know what a woman said? She said, when people park in a parking space and they're not lined up with the lines. What a long, hard life she's going to have, right? But see, it's her mind telling her that. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. It's one of those things where you can say, somebody one time said, you can be late and upset, or you can just be late. I thought, that's a brilliant piece of advice right there. When you get to the shopping center and there's no parking close to the door, well, you've got a choice right there. You can rove around and wait, or you can park farther away from the door. That's it. No more, no less. But we get, I never get the parking space close to the door. And we're driving around, and then we hit somebody because we're so upset, right? So we got to pull back a little bit. Viktor Frankl was in a concentration camp in World War II. He said the last of the human freedoms is to choose our attitude in any situation. The greatest freedom we have is to choose our attitude. And you want to look at where people don't choose the right attitude? Look at social media, right? We get caught up in it. And when somebody goes, I don't mean to be political, but, it's going to spiral downward very quickly, right? But we have the choice how to respond in any given situation if we take the time to pay attention, be present, and then acknowledge what's going on, right? That gives us the opportunity to make a decision. Now, a lot of this stuff comes from what I've read a lot of in the last few years is mindfulness. Mindfulness is something I think we should have been taught as kindergartners. My daughter's a kindergarten teacher. She teaches 1 minute of mindfulness every day. I think that's brilliant. I wish I'd known about this a long time ago. I didn't really learn about mindfulness really till probably my late 40s, early 50s. And what it really means is simply to be aware, to just be aware. I don't know if you ever heard that old joke about the guy who fell off a tall building, and halfway down somebody said, how's it going? He said, so far so good. That's mindfulness. I'm not looking at what happened or what's coming. I'm just in the moment. And see, if you think about where stress comes from, Eckhart Tolle wrote a wonderful book called The Power of Now about being mindful. And he said real stress comes from the fact that we are here, but we want to be somewhere else. We are here, but want to be somewhere else. That's what creates stress. It's not necessarily what's going on in that moment. It's that we don't want to be there. And that's not a good place to be. So when you want to pull back and think about what does mindfulness mean? Mindfulness means we have this moment in our life and that is it. It is the only time that you can have any impact on your life is in the present moment. You cannot change anything from your past. You cannot change anything from for your future other than what you can do right now. So if you wake up at 3 in the morning and your mind is racing and causing you stress, what can you do in that moment? If you can't do anything in that moment, then you are wasting that moment in your head. Now, this is powerful stuff, because anytime you find yourself under stress, if you step back and go, don't ask yourself what's going on, ask yourself, what am I thinking? And that changes everything. It changes everything about the equation. And so then we start thinking about what's actually going on in this moment. What am I thinking about in this moment? And then we have some opportunities to change the reaction and to change the experience. Now, I'm going to share a story. I was here in 2009. I'm going to share a story I shared with you then, but I think it illustrates the point very well. So I told you I grew up in southwestern Virginia in Appalachia. I married a woman from Long Island, New York. Now, I got to tell you, I was a little nervous about those two families coming together, honestly. All I could visualize was Beverly Hillbillies take Manhattan. That's kind of how I saw it all playing out. But anyway, so here's how this wedding was going to happen. So here's how this wedding was going to happen. We were going to arrive on Long Island at 4 p.m. on a Friday afternoon and have that first meeting of the two families for about an hour, that awkward greet and meet. And then we were going to go to the rehearsal at the church, which was just across the street. And then we had the rehearsal dinner after that. The following morning at 11 a.m. was the wedding. So that's the play of the weekend. That's what was going to happen. That was all that was on the agenda. So it's 4 p.m. on a Friday afternoon, and I'm waiting for my family to get to my future in-laws' house. And it got to be 4, 4:35, 5:30, 5:45. They're still not there. And we started talking about what might have happened, and we realized what had happened. They were driving up from Virginia that day, and they timed their trip so that they hit the outskirts of New York City at the Verrazano Bridge at 4 p.m. on a Friday. Is anybody by chance from that part of the country? Where do people in New York City go in the summer on the weekends? They go out on Long Island where the beaches are. They go out to the beaches. So you have this mass exodus of people going out of New York City. And my family is going to hit that. Now, my first thought was, I don't even know if they can get to the place, because they're probably going to get up there and they're going to see a sign that says Long Island left, and they're going to go home. My second thought was, they don't know how to deal with this kind of traffic. I come from a rural area. We didn't have traffic. The biggest traffic jam my family ever encountered was 4 people getting to a 4-way stop at the same time. And because they're Southerners, they're stuck there for 20 minutes because they're all going, no, you go ahead. No. Go ahead like that. And let me tell you something. I was in New York City not too long ago. Nobody said, go ahead. Nobody. No, not one person. Well, they finally got there about 6:30. We missed the rehearsal. The pastor said to us, well, just do your best. And that was our rehearsal. So we got to the rehearsal dinner. That went off without a hitch. Then we went to the hotel where I was spending the night that night with my best friend from college. We were sharing a room. And we got in our bed. It was at a Ramada Inn in Hauppauge, New York. Now, Hauppauge was 30 minutes from the church where we were going to be married. So we were 30 minutes away from the wedding. So we got in our beds that night, and we cut off the light. And when we did, the room went pitch black. We realized that it had those rubber curtains on them that like had the when you close them, they're just completely dark. And I just said to him, man, it's dark in here. I said, wouldn't it be funny if it was so dark I didn't get up on time in the morning? Don't get ahead of me. Well, I didn't think twice about that. I slept like a baby. Next morning, I wake up to a noise. Have you ever been awakened by a noise? You don't know exactly what it is, but you just jarred awake. So I've just jarred awake. And I'm like, what was that? Well, I look around, I can't see a thing, so I turn the light on, and my eyes are adjusting to the light, and I see my buddy Dave. He's just going around the room, and he's shuffling stuff on the table, and he's moving stuff, and I was like, what are you doing? He goes, I don't think we got our wake-up call. I'm looking for a watch. And I was like, oh, that's all right. My watch is right here on the bedside table. I picked up my watch, 20 of 11. We are 30 minutes from the church, and the wedding's at 11. I'm going to tell you something. I came out of that bed so fast, my underwear stayed in the bed. That was all right, though, because it wasn't usable anymore, if you know what I mean. So I got on a clean pair, tighty-whities, if you want to visualize any of this. I run out in the hallway of this hotel in just my underwear, because we had a whole block of rooms. I'm running down the hallway looking for anybody to send them ahead of time. And I'm like, help me, somebody, help me. And I don't see a soul. I'm halfway down the hall. I don't see one person. And that's when it hit me. Well, they left 30 minutes ago. They're already gone. And that put me in a whole nother level of panic. I flew back into the hotel room. I went in the bathroom. I turned on the shower. And then I was like, I don't have time to take a shower. And this little voice in my head said, man, you're getting married. You have to take a shower. And I don't know if you've ever been in a situation where you're so stressed out, but you can't make a decision. I'm standing in the bathroom of this hotel, and I'm going, shower, no, like this. And I can't stop. And my buddy Dave, he was in medical school at the time. He walks in the bathroom. He's just gone pale because I think he thought he was going to get to see his first heart attack. And apparently they hadn't gotten to that chapter yet. So he comes over, and he grabs him by the shoulder, and he holds on tight, and he says, calm down, settle down. He said, it's only 7:30. I set your watch ahead. They never found his body. Now, let me tell you something. Now, at the time, I did not see the humor in the situation. In hindsight, very funny. Why not? Because my mind had taken control. My mind was basically telling me, your life is over. Is that your future wife is going to think you don't want to get married, and she's going to pick somebody else at the church. And you know, everybody's going to think you bailed out. And in reality, what's the worst of the whole situation? I call them, I tell them I'll be 20 minutes late. That's the worst thing that happens. But I got so consumed with what I thought was the worst time in my life that my head led me to an overreaction. And in the big scheme of things, really, it just wasn't that big of a deal. And how many times do we get worked up over things that don't really pan out to be that big of a deal? I think sometimes we just have to step back and go, so what? We just have to look at the whole scenario and go, so what? I mean, Medicare shuts one of your organizations down, so what? I think that's just a... all right, maybe not a good example, but you know what I'm talking about, right? You know what I'm talking about. So this is what we do. So go back to mindfulness. So mindfulness tells us, you know, when you're in a situation, be focused on the reality, what's going on. I call it the real reality, not the reality in your head. It's really what's going on. And the way you practice this is you practice meditation, which is not about clearing your mind. It's about being aware of what's in your mind, just paying attention. And like one of the things they talk about, like I said earlier, is doing one thing at a time, don't multitask. And for instance, they said, let's say you go out on a walk. It's don't put earbuds in, don't listen to a podcast, don't get on the phone. If you're going out for a walk, be on the walk. Be present on the walk. Experience the physical nature of the walk. Experience the environment. And I thought, you know, that's pretty good. I live in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. I go out on a walk, I'm surrounded by beauty. I said, I should probably listen to that. So I tried it out. I took my earbuds out. I went out on my first walk after reading about this stuff, and I'm walking up the road next to my house, and I hear a noise in the woods. And I look over, and there are 10 deer standing there. And they're all just standing there looking at me like this. And we stared at each other for about 30 seconds. Then one of them snorted, and they all ran off. But that was extraordinary. I would not have heard that if I'd been listening to something and would not have experienced it, and yet that was in my reality at the time. So pay attention. Now, I told you earlier, I studied humor in graduate school. Here's what I know about humor. Humor is found in the moment if you're paying attention. You will have so much more humor in your life if you pay attention. Humor creates two benefits for us when it comes to managing stress. First of all, if you can laugh in the midst of stress, it can't possibly overwhelm you. And secondly, and probably more importantly, if we're trying to change our perspective, if we're trying to interrupt that process of thinking, humor by its very nature changes your perspective. In other words, humor makes us see things differently. And if we're trying to do that in the first place so that stress doesn't become stress after all, humor's naturally doing that. And we know from the neuroscience that if you're enjoying humor on a regular basis, new neural pathways are created in your brain. So let me explain how this works. Let's take a joke. A joke has a setup and a punchline. The setup goes one way, the punchline changes directions and goes another way. For instance, This mushroom walked into a bar. The bartender said, "I'm sorry, we don't serve mushrooms here." He goes, "Why?" "I'm a fun guy." All right, some of you will get that later. That's fine. And I heard somebody groan. Let me tell you something. I'm an expert in humor. You know what it means when you groan? Within 24 hours, you're going to repeat that joke. You're not fooling anybody. All right. So let's break this down. The word fun guy. Fungus versus fun person. Fun guy. Why does that matter? We now have two views of the same situation, and it is those two views that lead to laughter. So if you're exposed to humor on a regular basis, you will start to see the world differently, and that can only be healthy. It can only, because it gives us more options about how we see our circumstances. So what does that mean? It means you've got to look for humor on a regular basis. You've got to look everywhere. Problem is, it's not always so obvious, right? Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's just right there in front of you, and sometimes you got to look for it. I was in Oklahoma City one time, and I went to the baggage claim area to get my suitcase, and you know how that works, right? All the suitcases come out of the wall and goes around the carousel, and they all look alike. So you got to study them as they come by. So I'm standing there and I see a suitcase goes by, another suitcase, a woman's bra, another suitcase. Right there on the conveyor belt. All by itself. No open luggage anywhere around it. Nothing to suggest that it should be there. Was a woman's bra. I don't know what your first thought would be. My first thought was, how does that happen? I mean, I'm not an engineer. Can it just shoot off? I mean, how would it get there? And then my second thought was, who's going to pick it up? That thing just went round and round. Nobody touched it. Then it went behind the wall, didn't come back out. Now I'm thinking, what's going on behind the wall? Now that's obvious. Everybody in the whole baggage claim area is laughing. I told everybody I knew that day. I was like, you wouldn't believe what I saw at the airport. Everybody enjoyed that. But sometimes it's not so obvious. It's there, but we don't see it. I was speaking at a conference in Charlotte, North Carolina for a group of oncology nurses. And Charlotte is about 4 hours from my house, so I drove to that event. It was in a Hyatt hotel in downtown Charlotte. So I pull into the parking garage of the hotel, and I noticed that the parking garage had 4 levels. It had P3, P2, P1, and BM. The top level of the parking garage was the BM level. Now, what planning committee gets together and starts talking about what should we name the parking garage levels? And somebody goes, I think BM would be a good idea. And everybody goes, yeah, that sounds good, right? And of course, when I got there, it was all backed up. So this is the part that's so fascinating to me. I am speaking to nurses. I walk into the presentation. I said to the group, where'd y'all park today? They all said parking garage. I said, what level? And they all burst out laughing. But I don't think they got it till right then. In other words, I think they came in, they registered it, and walked to their seats, but they never really got, that's pretty funny, right? This is what we do all day long. We're just walking by stuff. It's just right there taking, and we don't see it. I was in Austin, Texas one time, and we were there for a conference. My wife went with me, and we were walking down the street one day. Early in the morning, we had gone to get breakfast. It was before all the shops were open, and we're walking along, and there's this shop there, and the sign for the shop said, Triple Z Threads, fine embroidered crap. That was the sign on their establishment. I was like, I would want to work in a place like that. That is bold enough to put that on their sign. So I wanted to peek in the door to see what kind of stuff they had in there. I turn around to go to the door, and there's a sign on the door. They're closed. It says, sorry, we're high. I mean, that's just so cool. You see this stuff everywhere if you got your eyes on. So, managing stress, change your perspective. Be mindful. Be aware of what's really going on, not what's in your head. And secondly, use humor as a way to do that. Use humor as a way to get a different perspective. Now, lastly, let's quickly talk about managing the work you got to do on a day-to-day basis. So, here's my theory, especially like in the healthcare arena. Most of us love about half of what we do, and we do the other stuff to get to do what we love. I know for clinicians, it's very true because they love the clinical stuff, but they don't like all the regulatory, all the paperwork. There's stuff that you have to do in your job that you simply do because you have to. If you had a choice, you wouldn't do it, right? So I don't care about the stuff you enjoy because that's already floating your boat. But the stuff you don't enjoy, that's where your return on investment is to put it through this do it well, make it fun filter. So 2 things. Do it well, make it fun. Do it well means maybe you need to improve your skills. Maybe there's something that you have to do on a regular basis you're not doing so well. That's why it's miserable. You know, maybe you need to think about it. I mean, all of us get in jobs and all of a sudden we have to do things we weren't trained to do, and we just muddle along trying to do the best we can. When I became a manager, I wasn't trained to be a manager. I was a good social worker, but not a manager. And the woman that hired me said, I'll teach you to be a manager. But then she left 2 months later. So now I'm stuck to learn this job on my own. And it had all this stuff I'd never been trained to do. So I went to school on it. I went to conferences, read books. I did everything I could to get better at it. Because when you get better at something, it's more fulfilling. So it's not as draining on you, right? So I don't know how many of you have ever served on a church committee. First church committee I ever served on, I went home and told my wife, those can't be Christians. It was the most contentious group of people I'd ever met. They were arguing about everything. And yet, this is a skill set that I have. I'm good at being on committees. I'm good at running committees. I just know I'm good at it. And so what happens then? I get on more committees. So a couple of years later, I got elected to the board of deacons in my church. Now, I'm Presbyterian, so the deacons in my church are like the social workers. We're sending cars to people. We're visiting people in the hospital. We're doing all kinds of stuff like that. And so I was elected to a 3-year term. So I go to my first meeting. It's on a Monday night. I've worked all day. It's on a Monday night at 7:30. The meeting ended at 10:30. So it was a 3-hour meeting. That wouldn't have been bad if we had been getting stuff done. But the content of the discussions were things like this. Do you think we ought to put the get well cards over here on this shelf, or should we move them over here where they're a little bit easier to get to? And I said, I can't take 3 years of that. So I came back to the next meeting and I said to the chair of the committee, I said, put me on the agenda. I got a proposal for you. So he put me on the agenda, and he got to me on the agenda and he said, what's your proposal? I said, here's my proposal. If you can finish this meeting in less than an hour, just once, I will dress like Vanna White and bring you a dozen roses. You see, when I was younger, I used to dress up like famous people, all kinds of famous people. And at the time, Vanna White was one of the most famous people on television. And we at my hospice had done a Wheel of Fortune skit. I was Vanna White, so I had the outfit. But these people in this church committee looked at me like I was crazy. They had never seen this kind of behavior in a meeting before. But then they became possessed with getting that meeting done in less than an hour so they could see me do this. So that meeting went from 3 hours to 2.5 to 2 to an hour and a half. The closest it ever got was an hour and 5 minutes. Because if it looked like it was going to be close, I'd throw out something controversial. I mean, come on, I'm not an idiot. I don't mind dressing like Vanna White, but I'm not paying for roses just to get a meeting over early. Well, it turns out that all the work that went into doing that ended up resulting in the fact that for the next 2.5 years, the meeting was an hour and a half on average. So we eliminated half the work of the meeting. The reason we did that was because we had not been good at managing the meeting. So what ended up happening was we got more focused. We eliminated stuff we didn't need to be doing in the meeting, and we were more efficient. We weren't doing it well. We were just kind of gliding by and not really paying attention. So that's the do it well part. The make it fun part is when we change something in the process to make the experience a little more enjoyable. You probably all read about this 3 or 4 years ago. There was an article in the national news about that children's hospital in Tampa, Florida, where they hired window washers dressed as superheroes. So the picture in the newspaper was priceless. It was this little girl in a hospital bed hooked up to all kinds of tubes and wires, yet she had this big smile on her face because Spider-Man was washing her window. Spider-Man, Batman, Superman, all that changing one step in the process made a huge impact on those kids. It changed their day. And then I thought about it later and I said, probably changed that window washer's day too. Right? This is not a great job. Probably doesn't get a lot of money. Probably doesn't get a lot of respect. It's a tough job. And yet one day he comes home and his wife says, how was work today? And he goes, today, I was Batman. Right? It just has a ripple effect. It changes the way we do things. I've started doing this thing when I go into a restaurant where they ask for your name for an order. You know how they do that at Starbucks and other places. We were in a sandwich shop one day and it was really busy. And the woman that was fulfilling the orders, you could tell she was getting a little tired. She was being very nice. She wasn't getting stressed out or anything. But you could tell it was wearing on her a little bit. So I watched them. She'd say, "What's your order?" And they'd give her an order, and then she'd ask, "What's the name for order?" So I got up there, and she said, "What's your order?" And I gave her my order. She said, "What's the name for the order?" And I said, "Handsome." And she laughed, and that hurt my feelings. But the best part of the whole thing was 10 minutes later when from across the restaurant she yells, "I got an order for Handsome." And I went, "I think you can see that's me." And see, that changes things. Even if just that moment we get a little bit of a break from whatever stress we're in, but it just changes things. And then we just start seeing all these opportunities for how we can change things for the better. We can make things more fun. Let's be honest. HFMA is not full of the jobs that are known as the party animals in the organization, right? The financial side is not necessarily the sexiest part of the work, right? It's a lot of intellectual exercises in doing things that are quite stressful. It's about doing things that affect the future of organizations. And when things change like they did over the last 18 months, it becomes even more stressful. All the more reason to change how you do it. You know, how would it be if in a healthcare organization somebody goes, "Our financial guy is a stitch," right? Changes things. Then all of a sudden people want to be with the financial guy. They want to work with the financial guy. Do you know what I'm saying? When I took over my job as in charge of social work, I decided I'm going to have the best department in my organization. It's a game to me. Why? Because I'm going to get good people and I'm going to keep good people. When I run a meeting, I'm going to run the best meetings in the organization. Why? Because then people will want to come to my meetings. They'll want to be on my committees. It's not rocket science. It's about playing the game so ultimately you're better at it. And it's all about saying, how can I either make it better or make it more fun? That's all it's about. So I'm going to leave you with one more example of what I think was one of the best examples of this. But before I do, two quick things. I'm going to be here most of the afternoon, through the afternoon break. I'm selling copies of my book in the lobby, right outside the door here. And 25% of the sales goes back to the Georgia HFMA. So if you want to buy a book, I'll be here through mid-afternoon, and then I'm flying out later today. Secondly, there is a form on your table. It's got 3 parts to this form. It's a perforated form. Part of it is a bookmark with a cool quote on it. Part of it is a tip sheet that you could hang on a bulletin board or in a folder. And the bottom part of it is a subscription to our newsletter. If you want to get a reminder of this, we send out our blog. We just push out our blog every 3 or 4 weeks. We don't burden you. We don't market to you, none of that stuff. If you want to get a reminder of some of this stuff every few weeks, just fill that out. Leave it out on the table in the hallway where I can get it. Just tear off the bottom and leave it out there, and we'll get you on. It's free. You can unsubscribe at any time. See, I think events like this are great, but the problem is you go back to work and business as usual. And we want to nudge you a little bit and remind you of this. So I'm going to leave you with one example of the greatest example of do it well, make it fun I think I ever saw. So when I worked in hospice, I was a home care social worker. And what that means is that I went out and did a psychosocial assessment on families. I determined how they were coping psychologically, economically, socially. And I went into this one family. I'll call her Mary. Mary was the patient. She was terminally ill. I went in to visit her one day, to visit her at home. And I walked into her bedroom and I realized she had makeup on, her hair was done, she was fully dressed, and she had done that for me. She had prepared for me. And I was very honored by that. After talking to her for a little while, talking to her husband, and then talking to her 2 grown daughters, what I realized instantly was Mary was the rock in this family. She was the reason they were all functioning so well. She was just a solid figure in the family dynamic. And so when I left that day, I didn't figure there was a lot for a social worker to need to do. And so I thought, they're going to do just fine. They'll be sad when she dies, but they'll just do fine. A couple of weeks later, I got a call from the nurse who said Mary had taken a dramatic turn for the worse. And she said they don't think it's related to her terminal illness. They think she's got a reaction to a medication, or maybe she's got an infection. And so we're going to bring her into our inpatient unit and monitor her to see what's going on. Our inpatient unit was an old renovated school building. It was a beautiful setting. It looked very home-like and just a lovely place. And I happened to be in the building the day she came, so I went to see her. And I walked in her room, and I could tell instantly she had changed. Her color was gone. She was having some trouble breathing. She looked very weak. You know how somebody just sinks in the bed when they're weak. And so I walked towards her bed, and she opened her eyes as I was approaching her bed, recognized me, extended her hand, and called me by name. She had met me once, and she called me by name. I took her hand, and I said, "How you doing?" She said, "Not good." I said, "Are you getting everything you need?" She goes, "Oh, they're spoiling me. They're bringing me things before I even know I need it." And at that moment, she raised up in the bed, and she was trembling. She was so weak, and took this long gaze around the room. And she said, I had heard so much about this place. I was dying to see it. She fell back on her pillow and burst out laughing. She's like, can you believe I said that? And I'm sitting there going, what's the social work response to this? I don't even know what to say. And so we just had this moment, this moment of laughter, this rich moment of laughter. 6 hours later, she died. And I'll tell you, it was the most profound experience I ever had in my life, because Mary was it. Do it well, make it fun, right? She did her life really, really well. But in that moment, which most of us would find the most challenging moment in our lives, she still had the ability to say, but I'm not going to pass up this chance to laugh. She had the balance. She embraced it, and I think that's what it's all about. I know you've all been dealing with a lot over the last year and a half in a lot of different ways, whether it's regulations, whether it's financial, whether it's just dealing with the ripple effect of the organizations in which you work. But we need you out there. We need you out there to do what you do, because you're an important part of the whole process for the organizations, for the patients, for everybody we serve. So I hope there's something that I said today will give you some little bit of insight that will make you a little more resilient, so we can just keep going in what is still a bit of an unknown world, right? I just want to tell you thank you for the work that you're doing. And I just want to thank you for the honor and the privilege it is to be back in front of people, with people in person again. Thank you all. Have a great rest of your conference.